Welcome to the Story a Day podcast. This is Julie Duffy, encouraging you to be a writer today, not someday. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It is Julie from the Story a Day podcast here, and I want to take a little break from all of the end of year planning and goal setting that everyone's encouraging you to do, and just talk about some of the a craft issue to do with writing. And this is something that I think is particularly important for short story writers, and that is giving your story a name. I think with a novel, you've got a little more leeway. You can give it more of a vague title. It's not doing quite so much to sell and advertise your story, because you're going to have back flap copy and you're going to have reviews and people recommending your story. But think about the reader flipping through an anthology, coming across titles. If they've never heard of you, never read one of your stories before, the title really has to intrigue them and pull them in. And what sparked me to think about this is I'm reading through the very excellent writing handbook that came out this year from Tobias S. Buckell, and it's called It's All Just a Draft. It's based on his years of experience writing and selling largely short fiction to the science fiction market. He's also written novels, but he started out doing short fiction. And so he really knows his stuff. And one of the chapters in that book was about titles. And it's something that people often ask me about. How do you title? Or they'll say, I'm terrible at titling. And you can't just say I'm terrible at coming up with titles and leave it at that. So I thought I would give you, there was a piece of advice he gave in that story. And he said that when he realized the titles were important, he went through, just wrote down 100 titles of short stories and examined them to see what they were doing, what information they were conveying, what they were doing to him as a reader. And going through that exercise, he said, took him from titling his stories things like The Fish Merchant, which was one of his early stories, which I have read and is excellent, but I only read it because I was determined to finish finish every story in the magazine issue that I was looking at. I have to say the title The Fish Merchant did not pull me in. I'm glad I read it because I really enjoyed the story. But after he had gone through this exercise of teaching himself to write better titles, he wrote a very successful story called Zen and the Art of Starship Maintenance. I think you can all agree that is a much more compelling title. It calls back to other famous books and titles that have been written by other people, but it's set in a new setting. It's playing with somebody else's title. It makes me want to read that story. I think you probably would agree that Zen and the Art of Starship Maintenance gives you a little bit more of an idea of what you're getting into than The Fish Merchant, which is actually also a futuristic speculative fiction story. Again, love the story, but he got better at writing titles. So that jump made me think that, he knows what he's talking about. So he talks about, in this one chapter in It's All Just a Draft, he talks about the fact that titles could do lots of things. Sometimes they're just phrases or quotes. Sometimes they're descriptions of what people are doing in the story. Sometimes they can be about the theme of the story. They might just be a name of a character and an action. And they might just be a description of the main thing that's happening in the story or a facet of the story. They might be just an interesting made-up word or name. They might pull a line from the story, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit, if I remember. Well, let me just say it right now before I forget. Quite often, I talk about this with theme as well, quite often right in the middle of your draft, once you've finished it, if you look right in the middle of your story, you'll find a line that exemplifies the theme of your story. And you can use that either just to talk about the story, or you could maybe use something from there as your title. So anyway, as I was thinking about this, I thought, well, maybe I should try this. So this morning I pulled down a whole bunch of short story collections off my shelf, and I wrote them all out by hand. And let me tell you, I'm recovering from having a fractured right pinky, so my hand is still a little sore, but I know that I process information differently when I handwrite. So I sat down and I wrote out the titles of almost 500 short stories that I have just in collections on my shelf. And it wasn't all of my collections, and I haven't read all of them. But writing down the titles was a really, really instructive exercise. So here's the top level summary. And then I have a little gift for you, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And I have some tips on things that I noticed about titles and what you might do to rescue your titles. So let's start with I really noticed a huge difference between the literary stories that came from the Best American Short Story collections and things like science fiction stories, mystery stories, horror stories, romance stories. These writers have very different ways of titling things. And it could be my biases showing, but I would venture to say that genre authors in general have got the hang of the idea that the title is the advert for your story. It's the commercial. And literary writers, not so much. There are some good literary titles in this collection, but on the whole, the larger percentage of boring titles came from the literary writers. And I suspect it's because, I don't know, maybe because when they expect people just to read their work because it's in a best of collection or it's in a journal that they've bought. I don't know, maybe they're just not as hung up on title. Maybe I just don't like them as much. That's always a possibility too. But here's what I found. There's like Tobias Buckell was saying in his book, there's different styles of titles. The worst ones I found, the ones that made me the least compelled to read stories, in my opinion, and you can figure this out for yourself. You may react differently. But for me, stories that were just a noun, the title was just a noun, I had no reason to want to read them, unless I'd previously read something by that author. So, for example, there are stories called things like Hare and Rabbits, and I was thinking of these as like, this isn't really a title, this is just a label that tells you something about something that's in the story, like The Archivists, The Lineman, The Return, The Plan, The Cottage, The Baboon, Sundays. And the literary stories were rife with this kind of thing. They were just labeling their story after they'd written them. And, the stories might be fantastic and maybe it doesn't matter. But it certainly didn't encourage me to pull them in. So I noticed that you can get away with doing this, with labeling your story, as long as you add an adjective. So things like the impatient archivist, or Christina the astonishing. They were much more compelling than just the rabbits, or it wasn't even the rabbits, it was just rabbits. And there was a story that was called The Art of Story, which is kind of blah, whereas there was another one which really caught the voice of the whole story. It was called The Great Interruption. The story of a story of Old Port William and how it ceased to be told, brackets 1935 to 1978. That's much more intriguing. Like, it's also a story about the art of story, but the title is so very, very specific and long-winded, and expresses so much about what's going to be in the story, the era, the voice, the generation of the person telling it, so much more than just the art of the story. Some of the stories did a little better, where they might have a noun and an adjective, like I said, or they would take a quote or a title and change it up a bit. That's a little more compelling, or they might have a geographical location in there which might pique my interest. Or they used a name or unusual combinations of words. So Beth 9, the story Beth 9 was interesting. There was a story called New Bees. Now, I thought that was quite interesting because it wasn't just the bees, it was new bees. What are new bees? Are they robot bees? Are they, I don't know. Are they genetically modified bees? I'm intrigued enough to want to read that story. Urban Gorilla, that was another interesting one. And combinations of names, Wolf and Rhoda, and another story was called Julia and Sunny. And these were more interesting. They were better than the just labelled stories. So think about whether you can give us a combination of names or give your label an adjective. I'm a sucker for a pun, so I loved stories that were called things like The Pirates of Penance. I thought The Brothers Brujo was interesting because it's playing off somebody else's title. It's playing off The Brothers Karamazov, but obviously it's not going to be about Russians. There was one that was called On the Street Where You Live, which is just lifted straight from a song title. One was called Sob Story, like the car make, but it sounds like Sob Story. I thought, I'm a sucker for a pun. One was Readers of the Lost Art. It was always fun. That makes me like the author and makes me want to give their story a chance. Another thing you can do with your titles is introduce a little intrigue. So there was a story called The Devil in the Barn. Oh, okay, that's interesting because the devil, but he's in the barn. Why is he in the barn? Where's this barn? I think I'm coming to the idea that the more specific you can give me, the more specific a detail you can give me, the more likely you are to intrigue me. And again, these are just my reactions. I highly, highly recommend this exercise of going and looking at just the titles in a bunch of different collections, in a bunch of different genres, and writing them out and seeing how you react to them. There's another one that was called They Told Us Not to Say This. That's quite interesting. A visit to Frederick Rouche's cabinets. Okay, I'm intrigued. Why do I want to visit his cabinets? I don't know. There's something else you can do that I think works really well, which is to make the title interesting after you've read the story too. So there's a story called A History of China, and it turns out not to be a history of the country of China, but the history of dishes as they appear in a family's life in different stages. So that was interesting. And I'm glad I read that. So not only was that interesting as I was going through the story and going, oh, I see what this is about now. I remembered when I went back through the collection, I was like, oh yeah, I remember what that story was about, because it was sufficiently interesting and clever that after the fact, it made the story stick in my head, which is a good thing. You want to be memorable in a good way. You can surprise people by juxtaposing things or using terms together that you wouldn't expect, like there was one called Control Negro, which was interesting opening. There was also Warrior Jesus, and one that was called The Snake Who Had Read Chomsky, which was unexpected. There's also, you can do things like you can set the scene, you can firmly put your story into a geographical or time setting. There's a story called Jollof Rice and Revolution, which I believe is a Nigerian dish, jollof rice. And so I'm assuming that is going to be, where that story is set. I thought that the genre stories did more, the genre authors tended to do more with their titles. Mysteries, they were very big on double meanings and having almost a mystery in the title. Things like too much time. Why is there too much time? Nobody ever feels like they have too much time, so what's that about? Another one was called Takeout, which when you're looking at a crime or mystery story, there's a double meaning there immediately. If somebody's getting taken out, or maybe it's just takeout. Red Christmas, again, when you're thinking about crime and mystery, the red very strongly suggests blood, but we don't know. The Drive-By and Deadbeat. These were, I thought, great titles for, although they were one-word titles and they were, if they'd been literary stories, I might have complained that they were just labels. But because they were mystery stories, they had this kind of mystery built into them. So you can also rely on your reader's expectations Or you can play against type, and you can play against their expectations. For example, in the sci-fi collection I was looking at, titles like Sharing Air, Before I Wake, and Vacuum States. These were all things that I thought would mean something to a science fiction audience that they might not mean to a general audience. So if you know the story is science fiction and it's called Sharing Air, your brain immediately starts thinking about astronauts in the vacuum of space, and maybe the air, has gone wrong in one of their suits, or maybe they're just in a capsule and they're sharing that air. Before I Wake made me think immediately of cryogenics or suspended animation for long trips on spaceships, and vacuum states is just a great term. You can also play against their expectations. There was one called something about a vacancy for the position of Jesus Christ, which I thought was really intriguing for a science fiction story, because Jesus doesn't really get much play in science fiction that I'm aware of. Also, there was a story called Rachel in Love, which doesn't sound like a science fiction story, yet here it is in this collection of great science fiction stories. So what's that about? Another one was the distinctive smell of wood lilacs, and I'm not getting that. The unmistakable smell of wood violets. So that's kind of intriguing, because if it's a science fiction story, why are wood violets important? So you can see you can play against the reader's expectations or play to the reader's expectations to give them a hint about what's going on. Another thing you can do is you can use contemporary issues, things that are in the news and in common parlance at this very moment, to intrigue people. There were two stories I came across which did this. One was called sensitivity training, and the other one was called safe space, which are terms that are kind of new and current, and people feel quite strongly about them. So you're not sure where the author's going when they use those titles. So what I have for you, if you come over to storyaday.org, there'll be a little form that pops up, and you can get my list of almost 400 titles that I put together that will let you do this exercise. I was going to go through them and highlight them and make notes and tell you why I like this one and why I thought this one was rubbish. And then I thought, no, because I'm responding to them very personally, and I want you to do the same. I want you to look through this list without any judgment and just think, which of these titles make me want to read the story, find the story and read the story. I haven't put the authors' names on them either, so you're not biased by knowing that you love stories by Ursula Le Guin, therefore you're going to read whatever story is in there by her. So it's just bare titles. And I would love for you to go through this and highlight things and print it out and scribble on the page and try and figure out what each of these titles is doing. Is it just a label? Is it a quote from something? Is it expressing something in the theme of the story? Is it a clever, intriguing, weird word or name or juxtaposition of names? Is it juxtaposing two unrelated ideas? Is it playing to your expectations or against them? And just go through that and react to all of these titles, and then start thinking about how you can apply this to your own writing. Based on this exercise, I came up with some tips for titling your story. If you want to use a noun, the journey, something like that, give it an adjective. The unexpected journey, it's been used, right? An unexpected journey, but it works, so steal from the best, mix things up, take common phrases. One of them was called a guided tour, and I accidentally started to type it as the Gilded Tour, and I thought, well, that's an interesting title. Guided tour sounds kind of boring, like an actual guided tour. But the Gilded Tour, I'm like, okay, well, what does that mean? So you can take a phrase that sounds familiar and just make it a little unfamiliar. You can put something very firmly in a setting or time, like the Jollof Rice and Revolution title. You can very clearly give us the voice either of the narrator or of a character in the story, and you might end up for this one lifting a line from the middle of the story. There was one called "So the Cold War's Over," and then there was another one that was just simply called "Ma'am," like M-A'-am, and I just hear it as "Ma'am," and I have a suspicion I know who the main character of this might be. You can play with and make puns and double meanings, like the history of China, which turns out not to be about the country but about the dishes, or take out in a mystery sense that becomes very threatening, and deadbeat again in a mystery sense that becomes that conjures up double meanings. You can be really clever, like there's a science fiction story and it's just numerals. It's 2BR and then a 0 2B, which I'm reading as 2BR ought to be. You can set the scene, you can quote a title, you can change it up. If you use a single word, it had better be a really good one. Like, don't just call it rabbits. I came across titles that I thought were good, and that was Goombas and Swarm, Gorgonoids, Hellion, Protozoa, Omakase. I came across ones that I thought were bad, which were like Dentists, Wives, Mama, Coyote, Balloon, Vines, and Persistence. Who wants to read a story called Persistence? Not me. And for bonus points, if you can't think of anything else, make it fun to say. Double crossing Delancey is just fun to say. So there are my tips on how to make your titles better. Don't get freaked out about this. Don't try and write the title before you start, unless you've got a great title, and you might just have a great title that intrigues you and excites you, and go for it. But this is just an idea of how to go beyond simply labeling your story, because your title is the sizzle that sells your story to the reader, and you want it to be more than just The Astronaut. You could get away with that in the 1950s. But now we want titles like Mantis Wives, or The Secret Lives of the 9 Negro Teeth of George Washington, or The Tale of the 3 Beautiful Raptor Sisters and the Prince Who Was Made of Meat. Something a little more intriguing. Anyway, that is my podcast for this week. I highly recommend It's All Just a Draft by Tobias S. Buckell, which is a mixture of, how he got into writing, having grown up in the Caribbean, what that was really like, and everything he's learned up till now. I recommend it. And then go over to storyaday.org and download the list of almost 500 titles that I've put together for you. Spend some time working on your own titles, and most of all, keep writing. Thanks for listening. Why not come over to the blog at storyaday.org and check out this week's writing prompts and articles. And in the meantime, have a great creative week, and of course, keep writing.